You hear about Viking raids and you picture shields and swords and burning villages. What you don't picture is England's highest churchman being pelted to death with cattle bones at a drunken assembly while his own captor tries to save him. Canterbury, April 19, 1012. The Archbishop refuses ransom. The wine flows from the south. The bones fly. An axe butt cracks his skull. This is how the most powerful religious figure in Anglo-Saxon England dies, and the shockwaves ripple for decades. His name was Ælfheah. Born around 953 in Gloucestershire, started as a monk at Deerhurst Monastery, left that comfortable life to become a hermit near Bath in Somerset. People noticed his extreme piety, his brutal self-denial. They elected him abbot of Bath Abbey. Guy couldn't even be left alone to pray without being promoted. October 19th, 984, consecrated Bishop of Winchester through the influence of Archbishop Dunstan. At Winchester, he builds a massive organ that can be heard from over a mile away. Needs more than 24 men to operate. That's the kind of scale we're talking about. He enlarges churches across the city, promotes the cult of St. Swithin. September 10th, 996. He presides over moving Bishop Ethelwold's body to a new tomb in Winchester Cathedral, building his reputation brick by brick, relic by relic. 994. Viking raid hits Southampton. King Ethelred the Unready sends Ælfheah to negotiate. He meets with Olaf Tryggvason, one of the Viking leaders. Sources say Ælfheah converts Olaf to Christianity. Gets him confirmed at Andover in Hampshire. Olaf promises never to raid England again. Ethelred pays 16,000 pounds of silver anyway. The Danegeld, protection money. It works for a while. Olaf keeps his word, leaves England alone. But other Danes don't care about one man's baptismal promise. 1006. Ælfheah becomes the 29th Archbishop of Canterbury, takes the head of St. Swithin with him as a relic. Immediate trip to Rome in 1007 to receive his pallium from Pope John XVIII, the symbol that confirms his power as Archbishop. Gets robbed on the journey. Even bishops aren't safe on medieval roads. Back at Canterbury, he orders a second biography of Dunstan written between 1006 and 1011 by Adelard of Ghent. He's building the cult of saints, strengthening the church's spiritual authority. May 1008. He attends a council where Archbishop Wulfstan II of York preaches the Serma Lupi ad Anglos, the Sermon of the Wolf, to the English. Wulfstan tears into the English people, blames their moral failings for the Viking attacks devastating the country. Ælfheah is there, listening to his colleague tell England it deserves its suffering. The Vikings aren't stopping. August 1009. A massive Danish army lands at Sandwich in Kent, led by Thorkel the Tall, commander of the legendary Jomsvikings. The people of Kent pay 3,000 pounds of silver to keep the army away from Canterbury. It works temporarily. The Danes pivot to London, attack it repeatedly, but London's defenses hold. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says of 1009, and they fought against the town of London, but to God be praised that it yet stands sound. The Vikings rampage across southern England for 3 years, Devon, Cornwall, western Somerset, South Wales in 997, Dorset, Hampshire, Sussex in 998. Kent in 999. They leave for Normandy in 1000, Durston return in 1001 to ravage West Sussex. The Isle of Wight becomes their regular base. They try Devon again. Exeter mounts a successful defense. If you value documented Anglo-Saxon and Viking history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the E version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which provides first-hand contemporary accounts of these events, and from the Heimskringla saga, compiled by Snorri Sturluson around 1230, which includes material from 11th century court poets who were actual witnesses. These aren't generic histories. These are chronicles written by people who lived through the terror or spoke to those who did. Now back to the information. Spring of 1002, England buys another truce for 24,000 pounds. King Ethelred is hemorrhaging silver trying to keep his kingdom intact. 1007, he pays 36,000 pounds for 2 years of peace. The kingdom gets a brief break to build a new fleet organized on a national scale in 1008. The plan collapses when one of the commanders turns pirate. The king decides not to risk the fleet in battle. Historian Frank Stenton later writes that England's fate is really determined between 1009 and 1012. The ignominious collapse of English defense causes irreparable loss of morale. 1009. The Danish army led by Thorkel and his brother Hemming is the most formidable force to invade since Ethelred became king. They're not just raiders anymore, they're a professional military operation. 3 years of sustained attacks. Then they set their sights back on Canterbury. September 8th, 1011. The Danish army returns to Canterbury and lays siege. The Anglo-Saxon forces defend relentlessly for 3 weeks. Olaf Haraldsson, future St. Olaf of Norway, reportedly joins Thorkel in the attack. 21 days of fighting, the walls hold, the defenders don't break, then treachery. A man named Ælfheah, abbot of St. Augustine's Abbey in some sources, though details conflict. What's certain is, Ælfheah had saved this man's life at some earlier point. Exact circumstances unknown, but the debt was real. September 29th, 1011, Ælfheah betrays the city, opens the gates or reveals a weakness in the defenses. The Vikings pour through. Canterbury falls not to strength but to betrayal. The Danes plunder the city, they burn Canterbury Cathedral, the flames consume one of the holiest sites in England. They take hostages. Bishop Godwine of Rochester, Leofrin, Abbess of St. Mildred's, Ælfward, the King's Reeve, and Archbishop Ælfheah himself, the highest religious authority in the land, captured. Some sources say Ælfheah the abbot escapes in the chaos, but the damage is done. The city is broken, the cathedral is ash, the Vikings demand ransom. 3,000 pounds of silver for the archbishop's release. Ælfheah refuses, not just for himself. He forbids anyone to pay. His reasoning is documented. The people are already impoverished from years of Danegeld payments. They've given 36,000 pounds in 1007 bosses, 24,000 in 1002, 16,000 in 994, 10,000 in 991. The kingdom is financially bled dry. Paying more will bring starvation. The Danes hold him captive. 7 months, September 1011 through April 1012. They keep him at Greenwich, then in Kent, now part of London. During captivity, Ælfheah tries converting his captors to Christianity. Some Vikings listen. This creates tension. The raiders want their silver. The archbishop wants souls. Neither side budges. Other captives get ransomed. The kingdom eventually pays the Danes 48,000 pounds of silver in April 1012. 48,000? The largest Danegeld payment in recorded history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle confirms this. 48,000 troy pounds. About 17,900 kilograms of silver. But the payment doesn't include Ælfheah. He still refuses. Thorkel the Tall tries to negotiate. He's the army's commander, needs control of his men. Once this resolved, the archbishop won't cooperate. The silver flows, but not for him. The situation deteriorates. April 19th, 1012, Saturday in the octave of Easter. The week following Easter Sunday, the Vikings are camped at Greenwich. Wine arrives from the south. The raiders get drunk. Sources specify the wine came from southern regions, likely plundered from wealthy estates or paid as tribute. The drunkenness isn't casual, it's thorough. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states they were very drunk. The assembly, called a husting in Old Norse, gathers a council or meeting. The Vikings are much stirred up against the bishop. 7 months of captivity, 7 months of refusing payment, 7 months of the archbishop forbidding anyone to ransom him, 7 months of him trying to convert them. The frustration boils over. The alcohol removes restraint. They seize Ælfheah, drag him to the husting. Then they start throwing things, bones, the heads of cattle, ox skulls, whatever's left from their feast. They pelt him, an elderly man in his late 50s being bombarded with animal remains by drunk warriors. This goes on. No one knows how long. The Chronicle doesn't specify duration, just that it happens. Thorkel the Tall, according to multiple sources including later Norse accounts, tries to stop it, offers everything he owns except his ship to spare the archbishop's life. His own possessions against one man's death. The men ignore him or refuse. The mob has momentum. Thorkel's authority fractures in this moment. One of the Vikings steps forward, takes an axe, not the blade, the butt, the blunt back end of the axe head, strikes Ælfheah on the head. The Chronicle records, so that with the blow he sank down and his holy blood fell on the earth and sent forth his holy soul to God's kingdom. Single blow, the Archbishop of Canterbury collapses, dead. First Archbishop of Canterbury to die by violence. The highest church office in England ends in a drunken mob killing. Thomas Becket, another Archbishop of Canterbury, prays to Ælfheah just before his own murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, 158 years later. The parallel isn't lost on medieval minds. Thorkel is appalled. Whether by the act itself or by his loss of control over his men, sources differ. What happens next is documented. He carries the body himself, or has it carried, to London. The corpse reaches St. Paul's Cathedral. London buries the archbishop with great ceremony. He becomes an immediate martyr. The people declare him a saint before any official process. Thorkel makes a decision. He and a group of loyalists defect from the Danish army, take 45 Viking ships with them, 45 longships, each capable of carrying 60 to 80 men. That's roughly 3,000 warriors switching sides. They offer their services to King Ethelred the Unready as mercenaries, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 10-12 states, then submitted to the king from the army 5 and 40 ships, and promised him that they would defend this country, and he was to feed and clothe them. Thorkel the Jomsviking, the legendary warrior, fights for England now. Against his former allies, the murder of Ælfheah splits the Viking force. Some historians suggest this is exactly when Olaf Haraldsson also leaves the main Danish army. Though the timeline is debated, the siege of Canterbury and the Archbishop's death become a fracture point in the Viking campaign. The Danish invasion doesn't stop. 1013. Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark invades with the intent to crown himself king. Ethelred flees to Normandy. Sweyn becomes king, but Sweyn dies in February 1014. Ethelred returns. The back and forth continues. 1016. Ethelred dies. His son Edmund Ironside briefly succeeds him. Edmund dies within months. Nut, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, becomes King of England. Nut has a problem. He's a Danish king ruling English subjects. The English remember Ælfheah, remember Canterbury burning, remember their archbishop murdered by drunk Danes. The corpse in St. Paul's is a constant reminder of Danish brutality. It's an anti-Scandinavian symbol, a rallying point for resistance. As long as Ælfheah lies in London, Knut's legitimacy is questioned. 1023, 11 years after the murder, June 8th specifically. According to Osborne of Canterbury writing in the 1080s, Knut takes a bath in London, not a random detail. He's interrupted mid-bath by news that Ethelnoth, Archbishop of Canterbury and Ælfheah's successor, has arrived in London. Knut immediately gets out, dries off, and takes control of the situation. The body of a martyr is valuable spiritual property. London won't give it up willingly. Knut orders a distraction. 2 monks, Godric and Ælfweard the Tall, prove surprisingly skilled at secretly demolishing parts of St. Paul's cathedral walls. They open the tomb, retrieve Ælfheah's body, spirit it away to a ship on the Thames. Knut himself is at the helm. They sail right past London citizens under cover of the chaos. The body goes to Canterbury. The ceremony is massive. Queen Emma of Normandy attends. She's Ethelred the Unready's widow, now married to Knut, bishops, earls, nobles from both English and Danish backgrounds. The reburial happens on the north side of the high altar in Canterbury Cathedral, near St. Dunstan's shrine. The message is reconciliation between Englishman and Dane. Knut acknowledges the enormity of the crime, honors the sanctity of the archbishop, neutralizes Ælfheah as a symbol of resistance by embracing him as a symbol of unified Christian kingship. The cult of Ælfheah grows. Churches are dedicated to him. St. Ælfheah at Greenwich, on the spot where he was murdered. The original building later collapses, rebuilt by Nicholas Hawksmoor in the 1700s, restored after 1941 bomb damage. 2 churches in Kent, at Seasalter in Canterbury, where his body supposedly rested overnight on the journey back to the cathedral. St. Ælfheah's Church in Solihull, dating to approximately 1277. A church in Bath in 1929, designed by Giles Gilbert Scott. The Pope acts decades later. Gregory VII canonizes Ælfheah in 1078. 66 years after his death. Feast day, April 19th. Lanfranc, the first post-conquest archbishop after 1066, is skeptical of Anglo-Saxon saints. He questions many of them, but he's persuaded of Ælfheah's sanctity. Only Ælfheah and Augustine of Canterbury among pre-conquest archbishops stay on Canterbury's calendar of saints. Anselm of Canterbury, later, between 1093 and 1109, rebuilds and expands Ælfheah's neglected shrine. After the 1174 fire in Canterbury Cathedral, the remains of both Ælfheah and Dunstan are placed around the high altar. Thomas Becket, moments before his murder, commends his life into Ælfheah's care. The connection between martyred archbishops is explicit. Medieval art depicts Ælfheah holding stones in his chasuble, reference to his martyrdom by projectiles. Paintings show him with an axe, the instrument of death. The iconography spreads. His feast day is celebrated in Scandinavia during the late medieval period, likely because of the connection to Knut. The Danish king who honored him becomes part of the saint's story. But back to 1012. The immediate aftermath. England paid £48,000 to get rid of the Danish army. Thorkel took 45 ships to serve Ethelred. The kingdom collapsed anyway. The murder of one man at a drunken assembly doesn't stop invasions, but it shifts allegiances. Thorkel's defection weakens the Danish force. The martyrdom strengthens English resistance spiritually, even as they lose militarily. The St. Brice's Day massacre complicates everything. November 13th, 1002. Ethelred orders the killing of Danish settlers in England. How many die is unknown. Sources are sparse, But the massacre is real. Palig, a Danish nobleman in Ethelred's service, is killed along with his wife Gunhild, sister of Swine Forkbeard. This gives Swine personal motivation for revenge. The attacks intensify. Canterbury in 1011 is part of that revenge cycle. Ælfheah is caught in the middle. He negotiated with Olaf Tryggvason in 994, tried converting Vikings during his captivity in 1011 and 1012. His whole approach is spiritual warfare, not military, refused to let his people be impoverished by ransom. That refusal costs his life, but makes him a martyr. The paradox is sharp. His death achieves more for English morale than his living diplomacy ever could. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is brutal in its honesty, doesn't sugarcoat the drunkenness, doesn't hide the bones and cattle heads, specifies the axe butt. Medieval chroniclers often sanitize violence for religious figures. Not here. The account is visceral. That specificity makes it credible. This isn't hagiography prettying up a saint's death. This is reportage. Thorkel's attempt to save him adds complexity. Here's the commander of the force trying to pay with everything he owns. His own men refuse. That loss of control is humiliating for a legendary warrior. Thorkel the Tall, chief of the Jomsvikings, can't stop a mob killing, so he switches sides, takes 3,000 men with him. That's not a small defection, that's a major fracture. The wine from the south matters. It's not northern ale, it's expensive southern wine, probably from Francia or further south. The Vikings are drinking plundered luxury goods. They're celebrating. 7 months of waiting for ransom money, and finally the silver arrives. 48,000 pounds. They're rich. They're drunk. They're frustrated with the one man who won't let them collect his share. The feast becomes execution. The Saturday in the octave of Easter is specific. The week after Easter Sunday in 1012, Easter that year is April 12th. 1 week later, April 19th. The religious timing isn't accidental. Easter is Christianity's most important feast. Ælfheah dies during its octave, the 8-day celebration. The symbolism writes itself from medieval minds. Christ rose from death. Ælfheah dies for refusing to impoverish his flock. The parallels are obvious. Greenwich location matters too. The Vikings camp there because it's strategically useful. Thames access, easy escape routes. Close enough to London for communication and supply, far enough for security. When the mob kills Ælfheah, they're at their base, not in enemy territory. They feel safe. That safety lets the violence escalate. The hustings is Norse government in action. Assembly, council, decision-making forum. But this one spirals. What starts as perhaps a discussion about what to do with the stubborn archbishop becomes mob violence. Alcohol plus frustration plus group dynamics equals murder. The formal structure collapses into chaos. 3,000 pounds ransom demand for the archbishop. That's 1/16 of the total 48,000 pounds paid. Not an outrageous sum by the standards of the time. King's sons get ransomed for similar amounts. Ælfheah's status warrants it, but he refuses on principle. His people are too poor. They've paid too much already. He'd rather die than see them starve. That's the logic. And the Vikings kill him for it. The burned cathedral at Canterbury matters. The Danes don't just capture the city, they destroy its spiritual center. That destruction is deliberate. Cathedrals hold wealth. Gold, silver, relics, church plate. They also hold symbolic power. Burning Canterbury Cathedral is burning English Christianity. Capturing its archbishop is capturing English spiritual authority. Both acts are calculated. Leofrun, abbess of St. Mildred's, captured alongside Ælfheah. Godwine, Bishop of Rochester. Ælfweard, the king's reeve. All important figures, all ransomable. We don't know what happened to most of them. The records focus on the archbishop, but they're all in that camp at Greenwich. They all witnessed the murder. Imagine watching your spiritual superior, the highest church authority, being pelted with bones until someone caves in his skull. That trauma spreads. Ælfmer's betrayal haunts the story. The man whose life Ælfheah saved opens the gates to the enemy, or reveals the weakness, or provides information. However he does it, he's the reason Canterbury falls. The treachery cuts deeper because of the prior rescue. We don't know why Ælfmer betrays him. Fear? Bribery? Coercion? The sources don't say, just that it happens. September 8th to 29th, 3 weeks of siege, not a quick assault. 3 weeks of the Danes trying to break the walls. 3 weeks of defenders holding. That's significant resistance. Canterbury isn't a major military fortress. It's a cathedral city. The fact that it holds for 3 weeks shows determination, and then one man undoes it all. Olaf Haraldsson's presence is important. Future Saint Olaf of Norway. He's still a pagan Viking warrior in 1011, not yet the Christian king who forcibly converts Norway. He's learning. fighting alongside Thorkel at Canterbury, witnessing the siege, present, possibly, at Greenwich when Ælfheah dies. Later sources try to clean up Olaf's participation in raids, but 11th century evidence puts him there. He converts to Christianity around 1013 in Rouen. The violence he witnesses in England might influence that decision. The money trail is staggering. 991, £10,000, 994, 16,000, 1002, 24,000, 1007, 36,000, 1012, 48,000. Total of £134,000 of silver paid to Vikings in 21 years. That's more than 100 tons of silver leaving England. The kingdom's wealth hemorrhages, trade suffers, the economy contracts, and it still doesn't stop the invasions. The Danegeld system starts with good intentions. Alfred the Great used it. Charles the Bald in Francia used it. Pay the Vikings to leave, save lives, preserve infrastructure. But it creates perverse incentives. Vikings realize England will pay, so they come back, demand more. The payments escalate. The cycle feeds itself. By 1012, the system has failed. England pays £48,000 and still loses the kingdom to Nut 4 years later. Ethelred the Unready's nickname is often mistranslated. Unready doesn't mean unprepared. It's from Old English unread, meaning ill-advised. Ethelred the ill-advised. His counselors tell him to pay the Danegeld. He does, repeatedly. It doesn't work. His counselors tell him to build a fleet. He does. It mutinies. The nickname is apt. Every decision seems reasonable in the moment and disastrous in hindsight. The moral crisis is real for medieval people. Do you pay to save lives in the short term? Or do you fight and risk losing more? Do you let the Archbishop die to save money? Or do you bankrupt the kingdom to ransom him? Ælfheah takes the choice away, forbids payment. The decision is made, but the consequences are violent. The theological questions echo for decades. Is Ælfheah a martyr? He doesn't die proclaiming faith against pagans. He dies because he won't let his people pay ransom. The church eventually decides, yes, he's a martyr. Pope Gregory VII confirms it in 1078. But there's debate. Lanfranc has doubts initially. Anselm has to rebuild the cult. The path to recognize sainthood isn't automatic. The parallel to Thomas Becket is eerie. Both archbishops of Canterbury. Both die violently. Both become martyrs. Both have shrines that attract pilgrims. Becket's is more famous because of the Norman period's better records and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But Ælfheah comes first. Becket knows the story. Invokes Ælfheah before his own death. The tradition of martyred archbishops is established. The political calculation by Knut in 1023 is brilliant. He can't erase the murder, can't bring Ælfheah back, but he can honor the martyr. By moving the body to Canterbury with ceremony, he achieves multiple goals, shows respect for English religion, acknowledges Danish guilt, positions himself as a pious Christian king, neutralizes a potential symbol of resistance, removes a revenue stream from London's church by moving the cult to Canterbury. Political, spiritual, and economic strategy wrapped together. The reburial of Archbishop Ælfheah at Canterbury in June of 1023 is not an end. It is a beginning. King Canute the Great, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, the man who drove King Ethelred into exile, stands at the helm of the ship carrying the martyr's bones. He is a conqueror performing an act of penance. He is a Dane honoring the victim of Danish fury. This single-night brilliant act of political theater is the cornerstone upon which Knut will build his English kingdom. The murder in 1012 was a fracture. The ceremony in 1023 is a calculated act of healing, a graft of Danish rule onto an Anglo-Saxon wound. Knut understands something fundamental. You cannot rule a people while desecrating their saints. You must adopt them. You must own their story. Canut's reign is a study in this contradiction. He is the Viking sea king who issues some of the most comprehensive and just Anglo-Saxon law codes. He surrounds himself with English advisors, like Wulfstan of York, the very man who preached the Serma Lupi ad Anglos blaming English sins for the Viking scourge. Knut endows monasteries, builds churches, and sends vast sums of money to the continent for the care of the poor and the glory of the church. In 1027, he makes a grand pilgrimage to Rome for the imperial coronation of Conrad II, and from there he writes a letter back to his English subjects. He writes not as a conqueror, but as their protector. He boasts of securing safe passage for English pilgrims and merchants, of getting papal promises to reduce the exorbitant fees charged to English archbishops for their pallium, the very symbol Ælfheah had traveled to Rome to receive. He is consciously undoing the damage his own people wrought. Ælfheah's ghost is at every feast, a silent observer of Knut's piety. The king's every public act of faith is a quiet apology for the cattle bones and the axe butt at Greenwich. He cannot erase the memory, so he sanctifies it. He makes Ælfheah not a symbol of English resistance to the Danes, but a shared saint for a new, unified Anglo-Danish kingdom. It is a masterstroke of statecraft. Cnut's North Sea Empire, linking England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden, is held together by force, yes, but its most stable component, England, is pacified by a delicate combination of respect, law, and the careful management of memory. He pays the English Church the ultimate respect by enshrining its greatest modern martyr. But what becomes of the man who tried to save him? What of Thorkel the Tall, the Jomsviking chief who offered all he owned to stop the drunken mob? His story does not end when he defects with 45 ships. He becomes King Ethelred's most powerful and most dangerous asset, a Viking to hunt Vikings. For 2 years, Thorkel's fleet serves as England's navy, paid and fed by the very king they once terrorized. The irony is thick. The English are now paying Danegeld not to an enemy army, but to a mercenary one. The £48,000 paid in 1012 wasn't a final payment. It was a down payment on a new security arrangement. When Cnut invades in 1015 to reclaim his father's throne, Thorkel remains loyal to the English cause, fighting alongside Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside. He is a man of his word, but loyalties in this era are as fluid as the sea. After a brutal year of war, England is partitioned. Edmund Ironside takes Wessex, Cnut takes the north. When Edmund dies suddenly in November 1016, Cnut becomes king of all England. And what does he do with Thorkel the Tall, the man who fought so fiercely against him? He makes him his most trusted deputy. In 1017, Cnut makes Thorkel the Earl of East Anglia, one of the 4 great earldoms he creates to govern his new kingdom. The poacher is now the gamekeeper. The raider is now the ruler. This is Cnut's genius again, co-opting strength wherever he finds it. He recognizes in Thorkel a fellow pragmatist, a warrior who understands power. For a time, Thorkel is second only to the king himself, but the trust between a king and a subordinate with his own fleet and his own legend is always fragile. In 1021, Cnut outlaws Thorkel, forcing him to flee to Denmark. They reconcile 2 years later, in 1023 hours. The very same year, Ælfheah is reburied. But Thorkel never regains his former power in England. He is made Cnut's regent in Denmark, effectively exiled from the kingdom he once helped defend and then helped rule. His story fades from the English chronicles, so a Viking lord caught between worlds, his final years a footnote to the larger saga of Cnut's empire. The peace Cnut builds is a personal one. It rests on his strength, his piety, his political acumen. When he dies in 1035, it shatters. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, squabble over the inheritance. The chaos allows the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty, waiting in exile in Normandy, to see an opportunity. In 1036, Alfred Atheling, the younger son of Ethelred the Unready, lands in England with a small force of Norman mercenaries. Attempting to claim the throne, he is met by Earl Godwin of Wessex, the most powerful man in England. Godwin pledges his loyalty, offers him hospitality. It is a trap. Godwin's men seize Alfred at Guildford. They blind him. A common method of rendering a rival claimant politically impotent? The method is brutal. They use a red-hot iron poker, but the wound becomes infected. Alfred dies in agony at a monastery in Ely. The betrayal is as shocking in its own way as Ælfmer's betrayal of Canterbury. The murder of the prince ensures the continuation of Danish rule for a few more years, but it plants a seed of deep mistrust between Godwin's powerful family and the remnants of the House of Wessex. When Alfred's brother, Edward the Confessor, finally becomes king in 1042, he never forgives Godwin for his brother's death. The instability that Ælfheah's murder presaged has come full circle, now consuming the royal house itself. The violence of the Danes has been fully internalized by the English political class. Then comes 1066, the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror arrives, and with him, a new church, a new aristocracy, a new language of power. The Anglo-Saxon world is swept away. William brings in his own man to be Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc of Pavia, a renowned Italian scholar and reformer from the Abbey of Bec in Normandy. Lanfranc is a logician and administrator. He looks at the English church and sees a messy, provincial institution full of strange local saints he has never heard of. He wants to standardize, to bring English practice in line with Rome and the continent. He begins a review of the Canterbury calendar of saints, and he stops at Ælfheah. He is deeply skeptical. Lanfranc questions Anselm, his protege and the future archbishop, about the validity of Ælfheah's martyrdom. His argument is precise, theological. A martyr, Lanfranc insists, is one who dies for the confession of Christ's name. Ælfheah, he points out, did not die because he refused to renounce Christianity. He died because he refused to pay a ransom. He died for a principle of social justice, of economic solidarity with his flock, but not, Lanfranc argues, for the faith itself. Was this truly martyrdom? Or was it a tragic, noble, but ultimately secular death? For a time, Lanfranc has Ælfheah's name removed from the public liturgy at Canterbury. The hero of the Anglo-Saxons is in danger of being demoted, his sainthood erased by Norman administrative zeal. This is where Anselm, one of the sharpest theological minds of the Middle Ages, mounts his defense. The story of this defense is recorded by Eadmer, Anselm's biographer. Anselm does not dispute the facts of the case. Instead, he reframes the entire question. He argues back to Lanfranc, presenting a powerful counterlogic. He says, "It is clear that he who dies for justice dies for Christ." Anselm's reasoning is profound. Since Christ himself is justice, to die for justice is to die in the cause of Christ. Ælfheah refused to allow an injustice to be committed against his people, the injustice of impoverishing them for his own personal freedom. He chose death rather than complicity in sin. Furthermore, Anselm argues, Ælfheah had spent 7 months in captivity attempting to convert his pagan captors, to turn them toward Christ. His entire captivity was an act of faith. His death was the culmination of that act. Anselm compares Ælfheah to John the Baptist. John the Baptist was not asked to deny Christ. He was executed for rebuking King Herod for an unlawful marriage. He died, Anselm argues, for truth and for righteousness. If John is a martyr, then so is Ælfheah. To die for truth, to die for justice, is to die for God. Lanfranc is persuaded. He sees the depth of the argument. Ælfheah is restored to his place of honor. More than that, his cult is revitalized. Anselm, when he becomes archbishop, commissions a new biography and begins the rebuilding of Ælfheah's neglected shrine in the new, magnificent Norman cathedral rising from the ashes of the old. The Anglo-Saxon saint is revalidated by Norman theology, his story now woven into the fabric of the new Anglo-Norman church. He survives the conquest not as a relic of a defeated people, but as a universal symbol of pastoral care and righteous justice. This re-established cult ensures Ælfheah's memory endures in stone and glass. The Church of St. Ælfheah in Greenwich still stands today, rebuilt over the centuries, on the traditional site of his murder. When you stand inside, you're standing on the ground of that drunken husting. The very air is thick with the memory of cattle bones and a Viking's axe. The iconography in medieval art solidifies his story. He is often shown holding stones in his chasuble, the vestment of a priest, as if they were holy relics rather than instruments of torture. This transforms the pelting from an act of drunken rage into a trial, an ordeal reminiscent of the stoning of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. The axe, the final weapon, becomes his emblem, just as a key signifies St. Peter, or a wheel signifies St. Catherine. The horror is tamed, codified into the visual language of sainthood, and the memory echoes in the most dramatic moments of Canterbury's history. 158 years after Ælfheah's death, in December of 1170, another Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, faces 4 knights loyal to another king, Henry II. As the knights storm into Canterbury Cathedral, Becket's final moments are a conscious imitation of the martyrs who came before him. Just before the swords fall, he commends his soul to God, to the Virgin Mary, and to the blessed martyrs St. Denis and St. Ælfheah. In his final breath, he connects his own impending death to that of his Anglo-Saxon predecessor. The tradition of a martyred archbishop, willing to die in defiance of secular power, is not just a memory. For Becket, it is a living precedent. The blood of Ælfheah, spilled at Greenwich, spiritually consecrates the ground for the blood of Becket, spilled before the high altar at Canterbury. The story of Ælfheah is, in the end, a story about the power of a principled death. In life, he was a pious monk, an effective bishop, a diplomat who tried to reason with Viking lords and convert them. He was a man of the church hierarchy, but his influence was limited. He could not stop the Danegeld. He could not stop the raids. He could not stop the betrayal of his own city. In life, he was largely a failure against the tide of violence sweeping his kingdom. But in death, he becomes something far more powerful. His refusal to be ransomed becomes a foundational story of English integrity. His murder becomes a permanent stain on the Viking invaders. A crime so egregious, it splits their army and forces a future king to spend a decade atoning for it. His sainthood becomes a battleground for the soul of the English church after the Norman conquest, a test case for whether the Anglo-Saxon past would be honored or erased. His memory becomes an inspiration for future martyrs. The shockwaves from that drunken assembly in April 1012 ripple not for decades, but for centuries. They shape the reign of Cnut the Great. They inform the theology of Anselm of Canterbury. They echo in the dying words of Thomas Becket. The image is indelible. A man of God, refusing to let his people be bled dry, standing firm as the wine flows and the bones fly. He loses his life, but in doing so, he embeds himself into the very identity of the nation he could not save. His was a death that built a legacy far greater than his life ever could, a testament to the enduring power of a single, defiant no